everyone. I'm Linda Yip. I have been asked by the reunion committee to reprise my remarks from Friday for everyone who couldn't attend the reunion. For those of you that may not know me, I am a professional genealogist, and I am pursuing international accreditation with the International Commission for the Accreditation of Professional Genealogists. I've written a book entitled Getting Started in Chinese Genealogy, a family historian's guide, even if you don't speak or read Chinese. And it is my honor to present to you today. Thank you to the reunion committee for asking me to speak. Thank you to my cousins and extended family for listening. In this talk, I'll be sharing stories about Wing Sang from an economic perspective. In this, I stand very much on the shoulders of the scholars who came before me, including Grace and Hoy, Lung Chik Wai, Graham, Doug, Lionel, Jim, Doc, Sun, Ella, and everyone who ever committed their stories to paper and thus made them shareable down the generations. I'm going to speak about the money. Many people have asked me what happened to the fortune. And while I haven't done a complete forensic analysis, here's the theory so far. I present to you the untold stories of Yip Sang and family. What happened to the money? Today we're going to talk about Chinatown when Wing Sang began, 1889. The rise of Wing Sang from 1889 through to its iteration as a museum in 2023. What Wing Sang did for businesses, what other businesses interacted with Wing Sang, Yip Sang's death and the aftermath, and then after 1927 in terms of micro and macroeconomic forces. This talk really focuses on what I like to call Yip Sang's third life. His first life was in California. His second was as what I like to call comprador to the the Canadian Pacific Railway's labor force in building the railway through British Columbia's Rocky Mountains, ending in 1885. Now, evidence suggests that Yip worked for the international human resources firm Kwong On Wo Company in 1880, and it was as their manager that he came to manage some 9,000 railway workers. Before I move on to the next slide, I would like to let you know that Yip Sang was 44 when he started Wing Sang. He was at the height of his power. Wing Sang was his new business venture, but it was not his first. As a genealogist, I build stories and work from, first, our family stories. Then I look into original documents such as censuses and vital records. I use original photos and do research into them to prize out what other information I can glean. I travel across North America looking at archives and original documents. I also look at the internet and what's online. But as a genealogist, my focus is on primary sources. That means original documents that were created at the time of event or very close to. So let me first take you back to Chinatown. In 1889, when Wing Sang opened, bearing in mind that it was begun in 1888, this is what it looked like. Wing Sang was built at the edge of a swamp. One of the impressions I get when I look at that building and its strong statement at the edge of a swamp was that this was a real sense of permanence, that Yip Sang was really putting down roots. He was saying, I'm building here. This is my anchor in the ground. And it would have taken a lot of vision to build Wing Sang where it was located, because there were mills, There was a lumber yard. The air was full of effluent. It was not the nicest area to build, but it was where Chinese persons were allowed to live. Now, I would like to first talk a little bit about what Chinatown meant to Chinese people. In this day and age, looking out across at all of my cousins from around the world, we don't get a real sense of what a hothouse atmosphere Chinatown really was. So, for example, it was the site of business. Not only Yip Sang, but also Chang Toi, his rival, his partner in business, and then later, Hokiat Louis. It was the site of what medical attention was possible for Chinese persons. Here, Nellie Yip Gong, so-called titled the midwife of Chinatown, she was a Yip cousin. Later, Dr. Q Gim Yip, our Dr. Q Gim Yip, who began to practice in the mid-1920s. Later, Doctors Wallace and Dr. Madeline Chung. It was the site of what legal advice was possible, first by one Alexander Gamyao, beginning about 1885, but he could not take the bar. Still, he had legal training, and later his son, Gordon Gamyao, became the first Chinese notary public in BC in about 1951. Andy Zhou was the actual first legal professional who attained the bar in BC in the early 1950s, and our Q Doc Yip, who was the first Chinese Canadian lawyer in 1947. He gained the bar in Ontario. It was the site of culture, gathering places of food and story, restaurants, tailors, all the services. It was where schools were with education, community, and sports. Here, Quene and the incredible rise of the Chinese Students Athletics Association. For me, it's a site of genealogy where researchers, funds, and museums are now located. And so let's start at the very beginning, what everyone probably has heard about. I found this ad in 1894 and for Wing Sang. It says Wing Sang and Company were wholesale importers, exporters, that it imported and exported Chinese and Japanese goods at 29 DuPont Street. Now, what I'd particularly like to draw your attention to is that few understand that in 1885, the Chinese Immigration Act defined merchants as those promoting international trade. Thus, to be in this classification, you really had to be in the import-export business. So, if immigration officials wanted to be persnickety about things, and they often were, they could pull merchant status from tailors or restaurants or shops that simply were retail, but did not further the international definition that was in the Immigration Act. Thus, Sam Key Company and the Wing Sang Company were two of those rarefied Chinese businesses that did actually fulfill the definition of what it meant to be a merchant and thus exempt from the rigors of the merchant classes in the Chinese Immigration Act. So I'd like to talk about what was Wing Sang to the community. Yes, it was the first two-story brick building in Chinatown. And in 1914, research shows that Wing Sang was the site of the first Chinese school. The schoolroom on the third floor was meant to be, yes, a school for the Yip children, but also a going concern of education, a consortium among other businesses to first site that school there. It was the first home of the Chinese Benevolent Association, and that means that it was like a social safety net for persons in Chinatown because there was no social safety net for Chinese, and we had to basically build our own. The CBA was where people came for help, maybe for a loan, maybe for information, and It was how the term guanxi, which is the Chinese system of networking, was cited. Therefore, it was a real meeting place for the community. It was a de facto bank and local business startups. I'll talk about this more in this talk, but basically there was no banking system for Chinese persons. If you wanted to get ahead and businesses need seed money, you went to your name association, the CBA, and you went to prominent merchants for a loan to get going. It was also the de facto post office. When Doctors Wallace and Madeline Chung bought the papers and eventually brought them over to UBC via Dr. Henry Yu's garage, thousands of unclaimed letters were there, which meant that these letters were actually sent to Wing Sang. The whole process of getting and keeping mail was that people in China would write the names and addresses in Chinese on the envelope. They would get a translator to write the addressee in English on the front. The envelope would go to Wing Sang to be posted in the window for people to claim. And then in reverse, Wing Sang would help facilitate the English language translation to get the translators to put, again, the addressee in Chinese on the envelope, the English for the Canadian Post Office on the front. And so a tragedy is that these unclaimed letters meant that these people probably didn't survive to claim their mail. So Wing Sang was the de facto post office. It was also the agent for the Canadian Pacific Railway steamship line, one of the more prestigious lines. And it was the Chinese agent for Canadian immigration. As a result, it was highly likely to be the center of news and gossip. And lastly, I would like to say that Wing Sang was a success model in a country where very few success models existed, where a poor boy from Toisan could be a success, and other poor people could come and say, look, if Yip Sang could do it, maybe I can do it too. Now, the Wing Sang assets in Canada, there are three geographic locations which I'd like to draw your attention to. I'm simply trying to say that it wasn't just the Wing Sang building, but that there were assets in Chinatown. The herring saltery was located on Galiano Island, that's here in British Columbia, off the coast of the Juan de Fuca Strait, and there were assets in New Westminster, which I'll go into a little bit here. So Wing Sang was at the heart of many business partnerships. I will not read this extensive list to you, but simply to say that there were many iterations of Wing Sang, that there were many businesses interlocking in this case, I have from 1893 to 1898. I would like to draw your attention to here in 1896, Yip On was a cousin. Yip Yen was also a cousin. Yip Hing was Yip Sang's brother. So in this 1898 Chinese Partnership Agreement, which was located on microfilm at the BC Archives, there are a number of Chinese partners. Yip Sang, his cousin Charlie Yip Yen, his brother Yip Hing, his cousin Yip On, Yip Loy, Gong, another cousin, Yip Long, Yip Yao, Yip Sing, who I understand is a member of the Yip Loy Hing family. Thank you to my cousin Greg Soon for that tidbit, and others. Here is a blow up of the signatures, which is, I haven't had a time to go through this Chinese Partnership Agreement, which I got in August of last year. But what I'd really like to show you is here, this is Yip Sang's signature, and here's Charlie's, and here's Yip Hing's. Aside from the marvelous original documentation, is quite clearly that our ancestors could read and write in Chinese and in English. Now, this is a remittance form from my cousin Robert, that's number 16 family, who sent me this image. Now, a remittance form is like a bond, a promissory note. When Chinese persons in Canada are here, I mean, why are they here? They're here to support their family back in China. The mechanism for them sending money from Canada to China is through the use of these pieces of paper called remittance forms. Now, this is in Chinese, and I had some friends translate. So this says, in 1930, this is an unsigned remittance form from the Yip Sang Company to the Sam Wo Hing Company at 21 West Wo Hing Street, Hong Kong. And so you would purchase this remittance on this side. The bond would go through to the agents on the Chinese side. The person carrying the bond would then cash them in on that side, and then that's how money would flow from Canadian workers to their family in China. It's like our own internal banking system. In 1905, I found this from the BC Gazette. And what it says is that Yip Sang, or Yip Sang, and his cousin Charlie Yip Yun purchased some property. And the reason why I really love this piece is how much property they purchased. And so here, let me count it out for you. To acquire all the rights, title, and interest of Yip Sang and his cousin Charlie Yip Yun for lots 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20, 11 lots in block 17, subdivision, yada, yada, yada. Again, I just want to stress, this isn't only Yip Sang that the Yip Sang Company owned, but 11 lots in Canada, in Vancouver. If only Yip Sang held on to them to today. Imagine what that would be worth. Now, I mentioned earlier that Yip Sang was the agent for the CP steamships line. The CP line was one of the more prestigious lines. And the reason why is because it ran the Empress steamships. There was first class, second class, and so on and so forth. Now, the CP line was considered more prestigious because the Blue Funnel line, whose tickets were sold by Sam Key down the road, tickets. And what this basically says is that in, what day have we got? 1920, we've got 6 people traveling second class from Vancouver to Shanghai aboard the Empress of Canada, and they paid about $581. We'll get back to that again. In 1906, Yip Sang established a new Chinese daily newspaper. This article is quite interesting. First of all, it tells us who the new editor was, Mr. Fong Dickman. The partners were Yip Sang and Lu Ji Wing. Now, Lu Ji Wing, if you don't recognize that name, was an impresario who owned one of the Cantonese opera houses. Cantonese opera was a very big deal in Chinatown in this time, and businessmen didn't confine themselves solely to doing what they mainly did, but they had their fingers in every sort of business. Now, I chose for my sample this article, which is fairly benign, but other articles in 1906 were pretty hysterical in terms of editors expressing opinions about whether or not Chinese persons should be running newspapers, like the shock, the horror of Chinese owning media. This is an expression of power. Communications is power. In having a Chinese daily newspaper, Yip Sang was not only declaring that this was a great business to get into, but also that we had the right to tell stories from our point of view. This was not, therefore, uncontroversial. In 1907, there were the Chinese, the riots. This was an anti-Asian riot, fomented mostly by labor groups. They came through Chinatown, smashing windows and terrorizing residents. Canada was reluctant to respond, but eventually sent their immigration minister to come to Vancouver to interview Chinese businesses and to basically ask about reparations. Now, this turned into kind of an anti-Asian immigration testimony. But what's really interesting for me about this is that rarely do we get to hear the voices of our ancestors from their point of view. And the Chinese, the immigration minister really liked sparring with Yip Sang. And so here it's in Q&A format. The minister said, "Do you own any stores in Chinatown?" And Yip Sang said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, what are the numbers of those?" And so Yip starts listing them off. He says numbers 1, 5, 13, 17, and 51, my own store, 53, 61, and 69 on DuPont. Also Carroll Street, 424, 426, 430, and 432. Also 3 in the back. There's no numbers, but there's 6 houses on Market Alley back at DuPont Street, 3 in Hastings Street, numbers 30, 32, and 34. What? Holy cow. Now, one other thing before I leave this slide, I would like to point out that the immigration minister later became the prime minister. His bend on anti-immigration racism was quite clear. And the reason why that's important is that he became prime minister, he was prime minister William Lyon Mackenzie King. Here's a map. I took a fire insurance map from around that date and drew them out. Here is 51 through 69, then DuPont, now East Pender. This is the Yip Sang property as we know it today. Here is the property on the corner of Carroll and Pender. Here are the 3, the back of Carroll. Here are 424, 426, 430, and 432. Here are the 3 properties on Hastings, 30, 32, and 34. And Yip also mentioned 6 properties in the alleyway. Wow. Now, this is New Westminster. My friend Jim Wolfe provided me this photo. This is a very rare photo of Yip Sang's properties in New Westminster. So the Yip Sang Company in 1899, that's 10 years after Yip Sang was established on DuPont, then Pender. This is on McInnes Street between Ramage and Carnarvon. Yip Sang owned lot 6, block 11. It corresponds to the description of 2 blocks with 4 stores. The pre-fire 1897 map also shows long blocks of stores on the lot. Here is a 1913 map showing these 2 blocks in New Westminster and the photo. Lots more research needs to be done into this, but just to say that Yip Sang owned 2 city blocks in New Westminster in addition to the Vancouver properties. Now, in 1909, Yip Sang crossed the border into Washington State with his family. He was going to the Alaska Yukon Pacific Expo. And at the time, all Chinese persons had to register for a CI-10. That was later replaced by the CI-9 process, the Chinese reentry immigration certificates. I could talk about that at length for hours, but let's just say this certificate proves that in 1909, Yip Sang was asked, "What is the title of your present mercantile business?" And for brevity, Yip answered, Yip Sang Company. The location, Pender Street had moved from, changed from DuPont to Pender, 51 East Pender. How long had the business been pursued? He said 20 years. How much gold had you invested in it? He said 20,000. And what's the present estimated value? He said 40,000. 40,000 in 1909. Holy cow. They were cooking. This is from 1914. It's from the Chung collection. And it is the application. It's a longer story, but basically Wing Sang asked the government for permission to establish Wing Sang as a proper post office. They said about 5,000 Chinese workers lived in and around Chinatown who were very desirous of getting mail, but they couldn't leave their businesses or places of employ, during working hours, and that the post office shut before they could get there. And so that they had to travel quite far to get into Vancouver to claim their mail. And could we please have Wing Sang as the local post office? That's what this petition says. Now, since Wing Sang was not granted the post office franchise, because to be frank, post offices were considered to be positions of power through which government was run. And, certainly we can't give that to Chinese people. Wing Sang was not given a post office franchise. Now, the Vancouver Chinese Independent School was incorporated in 1914. It was a part of the Benevolent Societies Act. Yes, this is the schoolroom on the 3rd floor. And the named partners by 1918 were these people. Okay, yes, there are 17 partners. What I would really like to draw your attention to are these people, who I can identify. Yip Sang, his brother, Yip Loi Hing, his cousin, Yip Gong, Yip Mao, that's number 3 son, Yip Shuan, that's number 4 son, Yip Him, that's number 5 son, Yip Dang, okay, you're testing me. I'm not sure. I've forgotten. Yip Gin, another son, Yip Hong, another son, Yip Q Park, Yip Q Shek, that's my grandfather. Charlie Yip Yun is a cousin. Yip Fong is another descendant through, I think, Yip Yun's line. Yip Sing is through the Yip Loi Hin line, and 3 more. These people were all partners in the Chinese Independent School. Okay, so this one's really interesting. In 1923, bearing in mind that was the same year that Chinese exclusion happened, all these little boys were being sent to Canada through Vancouver. Villages were scraping together every last dollar li that they had to send children as young as 11 and 12 to be sent to Canada to make their fortunes, to support the village. Now, oftentimes, they didn't have the money, so they would mortgage their land for huge rates of interest to moneylenders. But these 11 and 12-year-olds couldn't be trusted, of course, to manage their own money. So instead, that money was sent to Wing Sang to hold in trust. That's what you're looking at. This is a volume that provides a journal for the year 1923 of funds entrusted to Yip Sang to defray costs of immigration and subsequent living expenses for youths sent by their parents from China to Canada. It's a trust company. That's what this is. Wing Sang was a trust company for kids. Okay, so in 1924, Yip Sang filed a balance sheet. So for those of you who are not accountants, a balance sheet is a look at a business at a particular point in time. It's a single point just to see, when we take our assets and we subtract our liabilities and we look at our land and we look at our interlocking companies, what do we have left at the end of the day? It says Yip Sang and his agent, Yip Q Him, Yip Gin, Yip Shun, Yip Mao are all signing off as agents and partners in the Wing Sang Company. We've got stock of what else do we have? We've got land, total sales, liabilities, but in 1924, the Wing Sang Company declared that it was worth $216,288.99. But wait, you're probably wondering, what does $216,289 in 1924 translate to today? $3.9 million. It was a serious going concern. One other thing I just want to mention before I move on is that straight inflation doesn't really show an accurate picture of what this truly means. $500 in 1923 could cost a Chinese worker 17 to 20 years to pay off. $500. So when you're thinking about dollars, it's not only about inflation, it's also about man years or woman years in terms of payout. $3.9 million, or sorry, $217,000 in 1924 is a fortune. So let's look at property. I thought I would look at a couple of chunks of property. Today, 51 East Pender is worth $9.5 million, land and building improvement. The other block, which I mentioned, that Yip Sang declared that he owned in 1907, is this one. Here, I'll make it a little bit more obvious for you. It's the corner of Pender and Carroll. That block looks like this. And it is worth about $3.73 million. Yep. Okay. So as far as I know, this is the only known photo of the Wing Sang Company inside. It's about the 1920s, and I know that we have number 3 son, Q Mao, working here. Wing Sang owned at least 2 boats. This is the Yip 2. It was owned by Yip Q Dang after Yip died. Now let's move on to Yip's death and the aftermath. So this is a copy of Yip, the death certificate for Yip Sang. So he died in 1927 and he was 82 years old. It says 83, but that isn't quite right if you calculate it properly. He died of an ulcer. That's probably the stress. After all, the Exclusion Act had occurred 4 years earlier. The funeral expenses totaled $3,135 in 1927. Today, that would be about $55,000. His son, Q Sui, number 2, predeceased him. This was a major funeral. Here's a marching band walking up Pender Street and past the Wing Sang Company. I believe that this group of people comprises dignitaries. I think Sito Moore is in here. I recognize some family members. And I understand that the procession walked from Wing Sang up to Mountain View, which is a pretty far gig. The will was created in 1915. It's quite interesting to read how Yip wanted his assets to be divided. The trustees were, for example, his wife, Wang Si. Now, Mao, the 3rd son, Shun, the 4th son, and him, the 5th son, were the trustees for the will. The division went like this. to divide the proceeds equally amongst all my male children, with the exception of my sons, Yip Sui of the city of New York, in the state of New York, of the United States of America, and Yip Yao of the said city of Vancouver. The assets go like this. As to my improved real estate, it is given by me to my trustees in trust to be managed for the benefit of my estate for as long as my trustees shall see fit. Afterwards, to be then converted into money, the rents or income therefrom, so long as the same may remain unsold, being paid or applied by my trustees in the same manner as the proceeds of the sale of my personal property and vacant and unimproved land above referred to, upon the sale of any improved real estate, the proceeds thereof to be paid or applied by my trustees in a similar manner. In other words, Yip gave the assets management to his trustees to sell or manage as they saw fit. They didn't have to sell everything right away, but all my male children, 19 sons less 2 sons is still 17, and anything divided by 17 is a lot less. Sui was bequeathed $100 and Yao also $100. It was reported in the news that the total assets were 75,000, of which they broke it down. I'm not sure this figure is entirely correct, as in 1924, I did share with you the balance sheet, which showed some $216,000, but regardless, if the article is correct, that would be 1.3 million in cash and assets in 2023. When I was thinking about this and wondering, what happened to the estate, some stories suggest, it was gambled or, that it was mismanaged. But to be quite honest, I think there were many macro and microeconomic factors. In other words, it wasn't any one person's fault. It would have been extremely difficult to manage this estate through the Exclusion Act and the Great Depression. So let's go through a few of them. The Exclusion Act banned Chinese immigration in 1923. Yip Sang had major businesses which dealt with the comings and goings of Chinese persons between China and Canada. As the Chinese agents on behalf of the Chinese immigration branch, this would have been a big business hit to Yip Sang. For example, they wouldn't have needed nearly as much food in the Chinese immigration sheds. As the Canadian Pacific steamship line agents, ticket sales would have been hugely affected. In the late 1920s, early 1930s, Yip Sang provided bonds to Cantonese opera performers. I'll talk a little bit about that in a future slide. We had 23 kids. That's a really big family. If you have like 3 kids, it can be difficult to support, but 23? There was, some expectation of lifestyle, including travel. I will get into this in the future slides. Education. Education is really expensive. It's expensive in 3 major ways. It's expensive in terms of the lost income of the person who is not working. When you're going to med school or any professional education and you go through multiple years of education, that's lost opportunity cost in economics, is what it's called, of that foregone income. And when you're really poor and you need a child to work, so that's one level of, shall we call it, privilege. We were wealthy and we could afford for our kids to forego that immediate income in order to acquire education to gain a much better income. That's one. 2 is the actual cost of education, tuition, books, travel. We were able to afford to send multiple children to higher education. We were also politically connected in being able to wrangle our way into university. Now, I haven't done a thorough study of what it was like to get a Chinese person into higher education, but there were barriers. A doc went to pharmacy and law. Quene initially attended med school. Gim attended med school and graduated as a doctor. Suzanne attended Columbia University and became, well, a headmaster at a school in Guangdong. In addition, there were property taxes. There's always death and taxes. So let's start with the lifestyle. We're a big family, and in the 19 teens, we had an amazing lifestyle. I mean, look at this picture. Whites, hats, picnicking. You know what this picture really reminds me of? Gatsby. We were the Gatsbys. Here's another one. We are boating. Maybe this is the Yip, but I mean, hats, we're wearing whites. What this photo shows, this and dozens of others, is that the Yips could recreate. What a privilege not to have to spend every single day working or worrying about money. In particular, I also love this photo because this is a rare photo of Nellie Yip Gong, the white woman from New Brunswick who eventually traveled with her husband to China, learned Chinese, and it is said 5 Chinese languages in order to bring medical knowledge back to Vancouver's Chinatown for midwifery. Chinese births were held at home. How many Chinese babies did she save in a time when so few families existed? Like what we owe to Nellie Yip Gong before Dr. Q Gim Yip came on the scene is incalculable. Here's another photo. I mean, okay, yeah, we're boating. Yeah, we're on, what is this, a lake? I don't know, but holy cow. I also love this photo. Here's us, a motorbike and sidecar. In my talk on Friday, I asked my cousins to try to identify anyone, and we feel this is Q Art, number 18 on the bike, looking all James Dean. James, we're skiing. Chinese people are skiing. Okay, maybe you've seen this picture. I really love this one. This is in 1923. This is Yip Kyu Gin, Yip Kyu Him, Yip Kyu Mao, and Suzanne. And there are all their numbers, and they're sitting in this car, and they are all so proud. Well, this is a Chevrolet Model 490 touring car. We bought it for $1,102.60. Now, when this car was first produced in United States, it sold for $490. Do not ask me why we paid about double for this car, but I mean, come on. We had a brand new Chevy Touring 490. Rumor has it that my great-grandmother, number 4 wife, or third lady, Yip Chin Shi, learned to drive. And what I imagine is that she drove the Chevy touring automobile around Chinatown. This car today, and if you translate 1,000 to today's dollars, was for $17,000. But again, $500 in this day was about 17 years worth of life. It was an unimaginable luxury to almost everyone in Chinatown in 1921 when this car was bought. Okay, let's talk about travel. The Yips mostly traveled by the Canadian Pacific Steamship Line on the Empresses Asia, Japan, and Russia. This is a picture of the Empress of Russia, I believe. Here's a picture from 1931 to 33 of the number 4 families. This is number 4 female, Suzanne Yip Gimling. There are about 19 adults in this picture. Here's an old 1931 photo. These are all taken on board steamships. Here's the Yip Q Shuen family with, I believe, Beatrice, Benny, and sorry, I'm forgetting the last child's name. I'm going to get back to this, but I do want to stress that this is international travel in the Great Depression, the 1930s. So I was curious to know, what did travel cost? From the Chung collection, I was able to find a steamship stub. The oldest one I could find was from 1926. And what this says is that second class cost $250 for a one-way ticket from Vancouver to Hong Kong. So I used that as my basis to calculate the following numbers. Today, this ticket would be worth $4,300. In 1914, Yip Sang took his family to China to marry. And before I talk about the numbers of what that cost, I also want to stress that marriage was another marker of privilege, that only very wealthy Chinese could afford to marry, to have families, because it cost money for passage, it cost money to bring wives back, it cost $500 from 1903 to 1923 to bring a wife back. Thus, family was a sign of privilege. So, okay, let's go on. Q Shuen and Q Him, number 4 and number 5 sons, went to China to get married. They came back in 1914 and a party of 10. In that party were Yip Sang, his wife, Wang Xi, that's second lady, Chim Shi, third lady, their son Q Yat, that's number 19, the youngest, Shuen, his new wife, Li Sun Quan, also either Q Lap or Q Art, I can't quite tell from the passenger list, Q Him and his new wife, Li Lan Fan, and Yip Mi Go. I'm not sure who this is. So that's 10 people. Assume that it was $125 per person. So I'm taking half the second class ticket that we found in 1926, and that the kids are free. On the outbound voyage, there would have been 5 adults. That would be $625. On the return, there are 7 adults. That's $875. That's $1,500. In 2023, $1,500 is worth $44,500. All right. I really like this one. This is 1921. So this is the famous 3 photos. It's the story goes that cousins or sons 8, 9, and 10 asked their dad for money to go party in Hong Kong. And he said, "I'll give you money only if you come back married." So all 3 sons married in the spring of 1921. If I remember correctly, they married in consecutive order in like March, April, and May, or February, March, and April, and then brought their wives back. And they did it in consecutive order. So first number 8, and then number 9, then number 10. So therefore, they arrived on the 13th of June, 1921. They were issued entry certificates. The passenger fees would have been at least 3 outbound tickets and then 6 inbound tickets. We're going to assume again that they eat that was $125 per person. So 3 outbound tickets is $375. 6 inbound tickets is $750 for a grand total of $1,125 in 1921, worth $17,000 today. Okay, so here we go. Remember, this is this picture here. There are 19 adults on this steamer. If they really all went to China and came back, are you ready? I did the math on this, and then I did it again, and then a third time. This is the Depression, people. Did we really spend the equivalent of $430,000 on travel? Now, I promised you a little bit of a story about Cantonese opera. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Cantonese opera was a really big deal. Yip Sang entered into a consortium with setting up a rival Cantonese opera company against Sam Kee. Now, Sam Kee had one opera house, Lu Ji-wing ran the opera house, and the companies were friendly, bantering back and forth, like putting on productions. Cantonese opera was a really big deal because there was so little entertainment in Chinatown in the day. And for the price of your ticket, you could go in, sit on a bench. There would be like a little light bulb hanging from the ceiling on a wire, but you could lose yourself in opera for hours, and you could come and go, and you could chat with your friends, and maybe you could eat some peanuts and throw the shells on the floor. So it was really big business. And Yip Sang entered into contracts to bond Cantonese opera performers, groups of from 12 to 20, to come from China to Canada. Except this cable suggests that Yip Sang got into some trouble when some of those performers disappeared. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because each performer was bonded for $5,000. $5,000. And apparently a few of them walked off the boat, disappeared into North America, were never seen again. That can happen. And then, there's always taxes. Taxes happened every year. I don't want you to think that this never happened, but the reason why I bring this one up is because it was World War II. World War II, when Chinatown was suffering from the privations of the war, the difficulty with business. The assessed value of land was $24,000. In improvements, $22,500 in land for a value for taxation of $34,500, and the net amount of taxes they were assessed was $1,743.57. Okay, so $1,744, worth $29,450 today. Yeah, $30,000 in taxes every year. Every year. The fact that our family hung on to it until 2004 was a blessed miracle. So for macroeconomic forces, we have the Immigration Act. We have the Exclusion Act. We have the Great Depression. All of that real estate, those tailor shops, the restaurants, the part ownerships in businesses, the interlocking businesses, they depend on rental income and people being able to pay their bills. In the decade of the Great Depression, beginning 2 years after Yip Sang died, it would have been difficult for anyone to manage the company through that time. I believe it's very possible that that's how a lot of those assets would have been dispersed or lost, or simply we couldn't pay the taxes on them anymore. I haven't done the forensic accounting, as I said. It would take a lifetime to do it, but that's what I think. In addition, it is not quite true that as merchants, head taxes didn't affect us. It for sure affected us. For example, in 1903, I traced First Lady coming over, finally immigrating from China to Canada. She arrived in April 1900. She arrived with a party of at least 4 people. It was First Lady, Mrs. Yip Yao, that's Q Yao's wife, Q Shuan and Q Mao, the last 2 children born in China. All of them were assessed a $50 head tax. The reason why Dongshu was assessed a head tax is because Yip Sang's wife, Wang Shi, already took the wife exemption when she immigrated in, I forget, 1893, like 18... it was a few years after Wing Sang, 1893 was established. Now, there is some suggestion that possibly Kyushuan and Kyumao's head taxes were refunded, but I haven't got to the bottom of that yet, and there's some question that maybe they weren't. So that's $200 in 1903. In addition, I talked to you about the 1914 immigration of Li Lanfan and Li Sun Quan. Now, Q Him was an established partner in Wing Sang in 1903. Therefore, his wife, Li Lanfan, came across as a merchant's wife, and she was exempt. However, Q Shun was an engineering student at the time, and even though students were exempt, their wives were not, and therefore Li Sun Quan was assessed a head tax of $500. I'm pretty sure Wing Sang paid that. Also, in 1923-24, every single member of our family was assessed under the CI 44 registration process. So for the numbers that I know, this is what we would have paid. And this is just a few people. I have not done a thorough analysis of all the taxes we would have paid. So, head tax affected us too. There were many challenges to being Chinese and running a business. So let's talk about legacy. You know, maybe we're not rich like the Gatsbys, but let's talk about Yip Sang for a moment. Yip was an advocate, a leader, a spokesperson, a very center of a success model for Chinatown, founder, a philanthropist. He was our progenitor. To me, Yip was far greater than our progenitor. He was a pioneer. The more research I do into him, the more I think, why don't we know his name? Why doesn't Canada know his name? For a man to have achieved this much, he's like the Chinese Rockefeller. That's how I think of him. Rockefeller. You know, there is a reason why a small handful of prominent families make such a big difference. And the reason is this. The zeitgeist of the time made it almost impossible for a Chinese person to succeed. It takes money and power to succeed. Therefore, successful Chinese families break new ground with almost everything they do. And when I think about the Wing Sang company and our family, the Yip Sangs, and what we mean to the community, I think about the impact that one person can make. I told you about Nellie Yip Gong, Yip Sang's cousin's wife, and the impact she made to Chinatown. This is Dr. Q Gim Yip, who gained his medical doctor professional degree in the middle 1920s. He was unable to practice in the United States where he trained, or in Ontario where he gained his education at Queen's, but he was able to practice medicine, and I see his signature everywhere on so many certificates from the 1920s forward. Q Quene Yip was the star of the Chinese Students Athletics Association, leading his team to the pivotal provincial Brunswick Cup in 1932-33. 21 members of the Yip family played on that team. It's more than soccer. It's culture, it's entertainment, it's aspiration. Life isn't only always about business. And Quene was the star of the soccer team. Doc Yip became Canada's first Chinese-Canadian lawyer when he attained the bar in 1947. What did he do? Only repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act, along with his partner, Irving Himmel, a dozen other people on the committee, including Jean Lum. They spearheaded the repeal of the Exclusion Act, the head taxes, the CI 44 process, the documenting, the surveilling, when you went to the museum, you saw the impact of the Exclusion Act, and it was Doc who helped repeal that. Too often in genealogy, in our family stories, and certainly in people of color, we lose the stories of our women. And here I would really like to bring your attention to my grandfather's eldest sister, Suzanne Yip Gimling, who trained at Columbia University, came back to BC to teach, and could only teach in segregated classes. She pretty quickly learned that Canada didn't have a place for her. And so she and her husband, Lung Chik-wai, went to China, where Suzanne eventually became the headmaster of a girls' school. She innovated the practice of education. And later, when she was Madame Lung, she was invited back to Canada to share her knowledge and teaching. Go, Suzanne. Dr. Q Gim, the first in Canada, and K. Doc Yip, the first in Canada, two and our family. When I think about legacy, I think about us, about all of you. I think about this picture and our reunion. And let's not forget about our former home as now the home of the country's memories, the new Chinese Canadian Museum. We have much to remember and to be proud of. This is our legacy. Our family is around the world and pushing back the forefronts in every conceivable discipline. And I could not be more proud to be a member. In this talk, we discussed Yip Sang and Wing Sang's place in history. I went through some of the Wing Sang assets that I have uncovered. We talked about factors influencing the Wing Sang fortune and the Yip family legacy in 2023. For my sources, I have gone far and wide over the past 10 years, from the BC Archives and the BC Assessment Site, the Chung Collection, City of Vancouver, map collections, Google Maps, Library and Archives Canada, the National Archives in the United States, newspapers.com, Vancouver Open University, Jim Wolfe, Dick and Yvette for their photo albums, Grace and Hoy for photos and certificates, Robert for the remittance pictures and for ongoing discussions. To all of you, my cousins, my extended family, my immediate family, thank you for sharing all that you've shared with me.